Today we've got planned for you a pretty jam-packed agenda. We're going to talk about Windows Server, Azure Arc management capabilities, and so I'm excited to have Theo share with you a whole breadth of new Windows Server management capabilities for Azure Arc. Then we're going to have Nikita from the Arc SQL Server side share security best practices and what's latest and greatest from the SQL Server security perspective, as well as Defender for SQL. And finally, I'll be wrapping up with some security best practices for Azure Arc enabled servers as well. So today is really going to be focusing in on security best practices, especially with our Secure Future Initiative, SFI. And we're going to be really focusing in on the security by control and security by design across Arc Server and SQL Server. So we're excited to provide that double click with some advanced content today. So with that, no further ado, I'll pass it off to Theo, who's going to be sharing more about Windows Server management capabilities. All right. Theo, do you want to control screen share or would you prefer I control screens?
I can screen share
Okay,
if that
perfect.
works like better. Give me just a moment to set up on my side and then we shall begin. Let's see. All right, I'm hoping everyone can see that. Perfect. All right. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Theo Tran and I am a PM for Windows Server. Today I'm very excited to share every feature that we have and are currently building for Windows Server Azure Arc Management Services, WASM as it's known for short. So to get started, Windows Server Azure Arc Management Services are a set of Arc-enabled Windows Server features that will be released alongside Windows Server 2025 later this fall. It will include 5 services that you see here, Windows Admin Center in Azure for Arc, remote support, best practices assessment, disaster recovery, and then Network HUD, ATC, and ExcelNet, which are a feature suite of from the networking family, essentially. So starting off with Windows Admin Center in Azure for Arc, it is an essential tool for managing Arc-enabled Windows Server, and it's currently in public preview. A lot of you may be aware of it already, but using it, you can manage Windows Server OSs for your Arc-enabled servers, also known as hybrid machines. You can securely manage hybrid machines from literally anywhere without needing a VPN, public IP address, or other inbound connectivity to your machine. With Windows Admin Center in Azure for Arc, you get management, configuration, troubleshooting, and maintenance functionality for managing your Arc-enabled servers in the Azure portal. Windows Server infrastructure and workload management no longer requires you to establish any line of sight or RDP. It can all be done natively from the Azure portal. And Windows Admin Center provides tool that you would normally find in Server Manager, Device Manager, Task Manager, and other old MMC tools. Here's a list of them that are pretty popular with our customer base, but there's so much more, so please do check it out. And with that, we're going to move on to remote support. And so with this tool and a lot of the other tools that I'm talking about, if you are familiar with Azure Stack HCI, you may be familiar with these tools already, but we are writing in the functionality to make it compatible with Windows Server for Arc enabled, of course. So with remote support, it will allow a Microsoft support professional to solve your support case faster by permitting access to your device remotely and then performing limited troubleshooting and repair. You can enable this feature by granting consents while controlling the access level and duration of the access. This will essentially give you the ability to improve the speed to resolution as Microsoft support no longer needs you to, arrange a meeting for you to troubleshoot. You can view the detailed transcripts of all the executed operations at any time, grant just-in-time authenticated access on an incident-by-incident basis. And of course, you can define the access level and duration for each one. And then, of course, revoke consent at any time, which will terminate all of these sessions, and access is automatically disabled. Currently, this is still under construction, but once it does go to private preview, I will let you all know. Moving on to best practices assessment. It is currently in public preview. I know some of you have already tested it out in private, so thank you so much. This tool will continuously scan your Windows server and evaluate the configurations based on what we've defined as Windows best practices. These assessments will be ran automatically at a scheduled frequency, but you can also run them manually at any time. The Windows Server assessment assesses the server environment in the following areas. So server baselines, server security, Hyper-V, failover cluster, and IIS. It also collects and analyzes server data that generates a list of issues to address, along with remediation guidance, and of course, best practices to improve the performance of your server infrastructure. And features as well, such as deploying applications, software updates, OS systems, and all of these results are uploaded to your log analytics workspace. Yes, and it currently now is in public preview. Moving on to disaster recovery, as its name implies. It currently is in private preview, and it helps ensures business continuity by keeping your apps and workloads running during any outages. Disaster recovery will essentially replicate your workloads running on your servers from a primary site to a secondary location. So when an outage does occur at your primary site, you fail over to the secondary location, and you'll be able to access your apps from there. After the primary location is back up and running, of course, it will fall back to its original state. And this service works in conjunction with Azure Backup to ensure your data is safe and secure and also recoverable in the event of any of these outages. Now, moving on to the fifth and final feature, the networking suite of Network HUD, ATC, and ExcelNet, which is, I think, the net new content that we'll be talking about. I think some of you are already familiar with Network HUD and ATC, but these three separate features pretty much like complement each other very well. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll give a brief overview of Network HUD and ATC. But Network HUD essentially is able to identify misconfigurations on your physical network. It can also identify operational issues with, your physical hardware, NICs, cabling, physical switches, and it'll optimize your configuration for performance and then auto-remediate host issues to increase stability and performance. And then with Network ATC, this service helps reduce host networking deployment time, complexity, and errors. It'll deploy the latest Microsoft validated and supported best practices. It'll ensure configuration consistency across the cluster and eliminate configuration drift. And then finally, with ExcelNet, users can scale down their hardware investments. It'll improve your workload performance, of course, and then increase the density for containers and VM workloads, and then reduce host CPU processing, network latency, and network jitter. And that is the full capabilities of the whole network suite. They all work in conjunction with each other, so we recommend that you do use them together. However, you can use them separately if you don't need the other services. And then, so with that, that is everything I have for you all today. If you are interested in trying out any of these features, please go to the link you see on the screen, aka.ms/WSAAM-preview to sign up. Once you do, I will send out instructions for you all to test out and try these features if they are ready. And with that, thank you so much for having me today. I'll pass it back to you, Arnav.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Theo. This is super informative. I do see there are some questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to ask. Yes, Swen?
Yeah, hey Theo, thanks for the demo. I had a couple of questions about specifically the disaster recovery capability.
Mhm.
Is that essentially going to replicate to where? Into Azure, I suppose? Is it going to be using Azure Site Recovery under the hood, or what are some of the use case? I mean, yeah, some of the details behind that.
Yeah, Sven, you're absolutely correct. So if you are already familiar with Azure Site Recovery, or I think in the portal it's just straight up called Disaster Recovery, for like HCI, it is essentially the same scenarios and works the same in the back end as well. We're just making it now compatible for Arc-enabled Windows Server devices. That's it. Hope that answers your question. But I'll answer the questions in chat if folks aren't comfortable speaking up.
Awesome. Thank you again, Theo. This is great to see a lot of exciting demos on a lot of exciting capabilities. And you have that preview link as well, if you can throw that in the chat. I
Oh,
know
yes.
everyone's probably very eager to sign up for preview opportunities and get their hands on these.
Yes, I will. All right. Thank you, y'all.
Awesome. Great. So next, we'll have Nikita share best practices and security from the Arc SQL perspective. So take it away, Nikita.
Thanks so much, Arnav. Give me 1 second, and then we can go ahead and get started. Okay, sounds good. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Nikita. I'm a product manager in the Azure Arc enabled SQL Server team. And today what we're going to be doing is doing a deep dive into security for Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So first, I want to start out by just quick overview of what is Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, and then we're going to dive into everything that's security related. So just as a quick refresher. So Azure Arc allows you to manage all of your SQL Server instances from a single point of control, which is Azure. And when you connect your SQL Server instances to Azure, what's happening is you're getting that single place to view things like your detailed inventory of your SQL Server instances and databases. This is one of the capabilities that you can actually do today in Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. If you go in the Azure portal, we have a databases tab, we have availability group tab, and all of those populate information that you've previously seen on, say, SQL Server Management Studio. And with that, what you can do is you can actually write custom KQL queries to see all of that information at scale and create dashboards and charts, which may be useful for reporting and inventorying purposes. In addition to that, we also have an integration with Microsoft Purview. So that's really useful for unified data governance to help you manage your on-prem and multi-cloud infrastructure. In addition to that, we're going to talk about Microsoft Entra ID in depth today. But what that is it's Azure's cloud-based identity and access management service. So it's very similar, like as a concept, to Active Directory, where it gives you a centralized repository for managing and accessing your organization's resources. Another aspect is you get Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And what that is it actually helps you to discover and to mitigate any potential database vulnerabilities and alerts that you're getting for any unusual activity. all of those activities then will kind of populate in for you. And what we'll do later today is we'll see a demo in Arc SQL Server of how Defender works so that you can understand that more in depth as well. So that's Azure Arc enabled SQL Server at a very high level. But now I really wanted to focus in today's session about security. So this is just overall, a security workflow architecture diagram. But what I'm going to do is start out by talking about what is the most significant software components for SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc. And really there are two. The first one is the Azure Connected Machine Agent, and the second one is the Azure extension for SQL Server. So let's talk a little bit about what each of these are. So the Azure Connected Machine Agent it connects servers to Azure. That's essentially what it does. And the Azure extension for SQL Server, it sends data to Azure about the SQL Server, and it retrieves commands from Azure through an Azure Relay communication channel. And what that does is it actually helps you take action on the SQL Server instance. So together, this agent and the extension is letting you manage your instances and databases located anywhere outside of Azure. An instance of SQL Server with the agent and the extension is enabled by Azure Arc. So this agent and extension securely connect to Azure to establish communication channels with Microsoft managed Azure services. Now, when we think a little bit about data collection and reporting, some of the services require something that we call the Azure Monitoring Agent, also known as the AMA agent or extension. This extension needs to be connected to the Azure Log Analytics workspace. And the two services today which require this AMA service are Microsoft Defender for Cloud and also the SQL Server Best Practices Assessment. The Azure extension for SQL Server lets you discover, host or OS level configuration changes for all of your SQL Server instances on a pretty granular level. So for example, these could be things like, SQL Server Engine instances on a host machine, databases within a SQL Server instance, availability groups. Overall, the Azure extension for SQL Server is letting you centrally manage, secure, and govern your SQL Server instances anywhere by collecting data for tasks like inventory, monitoring, and other tasks as well. So now that we have a pretty good overview of Azure Arc enabled SQL Server at a high level, let's go a little bit more in depth into the security. So I want to talk about least privileges for Arc enabled SQL Server. So the information security principle of least privileges states that accounts and applications should only have access to the data and operations that they require. That's the concept. So with SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc, you can actually run the agent extension service with least privileges. And when you configure this mode, when it's configured for least privileges, the extension service runs as NT Service SQL Server Extension Service Account. That service account is a local Windows service account, and it's created and managed by the Azure extension for SQL Server Deployer when the least privileges option is enabled. That also grants the minimum required permissions and privileges to run this extension on the Windows operating system, which means that it only has access to folders and directories that are used for reading and storing configuration or writing logs. And on top of this, it's also granted permission to connect and query in the SQL Server with a new login specifically for the Azure extension for SQL Server service account, which has the minimum permissions required. The minimum permissions, I do want to note, depends on the enabled features that you have, because for a lot of these features, you need to enable it. That being said, it's updated when permissions are no longer necessary as well. So let's take an example. Let's say that, permissions are revoked when you disable a feature. So if you disable something like least privileges configuration or you uninstall the Azure extension for SQL Server, then it revokes that access. So what this helps ensure is that permissions no longer remain after they're no longer required. One of the things that I want to point out right now in our documentation page, you will actually notice that you can opt into this least privileges mode. There's a CLI command, and I'll show it to everyone in the next slide as well. In the coming months, this will actually be the default mode going forward. So you'll notice least privileges mode for added security will be made available to you. If for some reason you want to prevent this automatic update, then all we say is, block the extension upgrade to a specific version, right, which is listed here. Again, all of this is available in our documentation site, so definitely look there for the latest information. If you want to opt into least privileges mode while it's, coming, this is the command that you will actually run to set it up in your environment. So highly would recommend everyone to try that out, and feel free to check out the documentation for more details. Towards the ending of the call, I will also add this into the chat so that everyone has it for reference. So now let's talk a little bit about feature level security for SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc. We've talked about the architecture, we've talked about least privileges, but let's talk about how the features work and what is happening there. So let's first talk about Microsoft Entra ID. So what is Microsoft Entra ID? I had mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but essentially what it is it is a cloud-based identity and access management service. And what that is useful for is enabling access to external resources. Microsoft Entra authentication gives you greater security over traditional username, password-based authentication, and SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc actually uses Microsoft Entra ID for authentication. This is introduced for SQL Server 2022. So if you have a previous version, just keep in mind that that's not there. What this does is it gives you a centralized identity and access management solution to SQL Server. And when we think about security, SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc is actually storing the certificate from Microsoft Entra ID in Azure Key Vault. All of this is there in the portal experience and in our documentation today. So if you want to try it out, you have a SQL Server 22, it's Arc enabled, and you want to use Microsoft Entra ID, I've also added a link here and I'll put it in the chat later for how you can quickly get set up and get up and running with this too. But besides Entra ID, we also have a lot of other security offerings. Another one is Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and we're going to take a look at a demo later today of exactly how Microsoft Defender for Cloud works as well. But at a high level, what is Microsoft Defender for Cloud? It helps you to discover and mitigate any potential database vulnerabilities and alerts for unusual activity that you may see. So these activities may indicate threats to your databases on SQL Server instances. And what you'll notice is the assessment, there's a vulnerability assessment, and it scans databases to discover, track, and solve, right, the vulnerabilities which are there. You get threat protection details on security alerts and recommendations for how you can take action to mitigate those threats as well. So now let's take a look at how Microsoft Defender for Cloud works in SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc. So yeah, let's take a look at Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I'm inside of the Azure portal in a SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc resource right now. And on a high level, again, Defender for Cloud is going to go ahead and check for me if there are any security threats in the Azure Security Center. And it's going to return information as to what are those different recommendations for those specific threats as well. So you'll notice there's a security section here in the Azure portal. And if we go ahead and we click on it, what you will notice is it will give me all of these different recommendations for Defender. And you'll notice that I have 5 recommendations here for areas where there's potentially a security threat. And below it gives me descriptions of what each of those are and the severity. So is it low, medium, or high? Here you can see that I have 1 low, 2 high, and 2 medium in terms of severity recommendations. So one of them says, right, machines should be configured periodically to check for missing system updates. Let's actually go ahead, click into this, and actually see what happens if I now know this is the issue, but I want to go ahead and find a potential solution to mitigate this threat. So if you go inside, what you'll notice is I can see here that it shows me the severities with high, so high severities, and it also tells me how I can mitigate the threat and how many of my affected resources are there. So 5 out of 7 are affected here. And if I click inside, it's going to actually give me a recommendation and also show which machines are affected, which is really useful. So I can quickly detect which machines are in an unhealthy state and which are in a healthy state as well. So if we go right and we pick one of them, what you will actually notice is it gives me steps for a quick fix and also a manual fix. This is one example of how Defender for Cloud is really, really helpful. But let's go ahead and take a look at one more example together now that we've got a sense of how this works. So let's take a look at this one. Right, for vulnerabilities and security configuration on the Windows machine should be fixed. So if we go ahead and just like we did earlier, we click inside, we will see a description of what this issue is. And I can see it's low severity. I can also see how many resources are affected. So you can see 293 are affected. And if you go ahead and you click inside, actually, it's going to show me how I can potentially do a quick fix or a manual fix, and also which are the affected resources that are in that unhealthy state. And this is at a high level what the goal is of Microsoft Defender. We want to make sure that all of the resources are in a healthy state, that there are no security threats for your data estate, and it will give you recommendations so that you no longer have to worry about every day manually going in and checking. It's automating the process for you so your security team can come in and mitigate issues as soon as possible. So now that we've talked about Microsoft Entra ID, Microsoft Defender, let's go ahead and talk about the best practices assessment for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. The best practices assessment is giving you a mechanism to evaluate the configuration of your SQL Server. After you enable this best practices assessment, what's happening is that the assessment is actually scanning your SQL Server instances and databases to provide you recommendations for things like SQL Server and database configurations, index management, deprecated features, enabled or missing trace flags, and so much more. So you can see here a quick snapshot of what that best practices assessment looks like. Very similar to how we saw Microsoft Defender. If you go inside of the Azure portal, there's a best practices assessment tab. You can click on that and configure the assessment from there. And then it scans against the rule set and gives you a very similar recommendation and experience. So when we think a little bit about, the best practices assessment and security, some areas to keep in mind is that the user who's configuring the SQL best practice assessment should have the required permissions that they need. So for example, a log analytics contributor role on that resource group is definitely needed as well. The Azure Connected Machine resource role on the resource group is also needed as well, so on and so forth. A lot of this is in our documentation today, so definitely take a look at that. And then you do need some minimum permissions to actually access and read the reports. Those ones are listed here too, so you can take a look. And then one thing that I do want to point out is the SQL Best Practices Assessment uses that Azure Monitoring Agent, the AMA agent that we had discussed earlier, and it does this to collect and analyze data from your SQL servers. So if you have AMA installed on your SQL servers before enabling BPA, BPA is using that same AMA agent and proxy settings. You don't need to do anything else. However, if you don't have AMA installed on your SQL servers, then BPA will go ahead and install it for you. It will not set up the proxy settings for AMA automatically, so you will need to redeploy AMA with those proxy settings if you want. So some aspects to keep in mind, I would definitely recommend for everyone who hasn't tried the best practices assessment, do go inside of the Azure portal and Arc-enabled SQL Server and give it a try. Those are all of the main areas, right? When we think about security-related features for Arc-enabled SQL Server, we covered Entra ID, Microsoft Defender, and the best practices assessment. So yeah, thanks to everyone for listening, and I will hand it back to you, Arnav, to talk about Arc-enabled servers.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great and really informative. I'm sure folks have some questions.
Yeah,
If anyone has
questions, feel free to add it in the chat and I can answer them, or if you want to share here, either way works. Okay, so one question I see is about BPA. So BPA generally looks at, there's an existing rule set for which it gives you recommendations for. Can you write your own BPA checks? I'll take a look at that, but I'll send you a link to the docs that we have for Arc SQL Server. I think that is one which will help address your question. So I'll put that in as well. Okay. If folks have any other questions, feel free to add it in the chat and I will take a look. So I see one question is there on least privileges. Is there anything that will be done to reduce privileges of NT authority system? So as I mentioned, least privileges right now is like what we have. I'll put it in the chat as well so that you can read up on the documentation page what we have. And as new aspects will be coming out, we will always communicate to you and I will let you know in these calls as well. But yes, what I covered is where we are at today.
And I think Carl has his hand raised. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I've asked it in the chat, but it's quite busy there. So my question was like this SQL integration and security integration, is this completely targeted to the AMA, or is there a chance that a customer could accidentally use the old agent, or is it not possible technically? So it's a limit, like you can only go the new way, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Let me follow up on that one with you in the chat. I'll send you details
Okay.
on the AMA agent as well in Arc SQL Server. The other piece that I also do want to point out is we actually recently launched for Arc SQL Server a new security document as part of our docs page, which covers everything that you need to know for Arc SQL Server. So if you have any security related questions, this is for everyone, definitely look there as well. We've put
Okay.
all our details in.
All right. If there's no further questions, thank you again. And folks can please continue to put questions into the chat as well. Great. So I'll go ahead and we'll go into the last segment where I'll talk a little bit about Arc Server best security practices. So I'll go ahead and share from here. And so we're really going to be double clicking on a lot of the different security facets for the connected machine agent. So before we get started with that, I just wanted to level set and kind of talk through what are the main components of the connected machine agent, right, from architectural perspective. And then we'll be going into sort of different facets from a security lens for the hybrid RP, right? So at a high level, as you're likely aware, every Arc-enabled server has the connected machine agent. And that connected machine agent has three core components. It has Hybrid Instance Metadata Service, HAMDS. So that's handling the managed identity, that's sending the heartbeats to establish connectivity with Azure. Then you have machine config, guest configuration. We know there's a lot of DSC fans, a lot of Azure policy users here. That's what allows those in-guest policy capabilities like assessments, right? TLS protocol assessment, for example, security baselines, etc. And finally, the third component is Extension Manager, and that allows you to manage different VM extensions, including their install, uninstall, and upgrade. So the whole gamut of VM extensions that are supported for Arc, like you're aware, custom script, MDE, AMA, just to name a few. There's some 70 plus VM extensions supported for Arc. And so those three components together, HIMDS, guest config, and extension manager, together constitute the connected machine agent. What we're going to be talking about from a security best practice lens is how each of those have security both by control and by design. And we're going to be talking through different ways that you can do further hardening beyond what's currently available, as well as what's already there from a security best practice perspective we're taking. And so we'll highlight this across five kind of core pillars. We'll start off with onboarding. Then we'll be talking about extensions, which are obviously top of mind for folks, touching on identity and authorization, configuration capabilities through guest config and our connectivity platform, and finally touching on networking as well. Now, one thing I do want to note is we have a broad security guidance. So in our docs, we've added an entire section on just security best practices, over 8-10 articles on different security best practices for Arc Server that are going to be a lot more comprehensive than this, where I'm just going to be highlighting some of the top security best practices at a high level. So we'll go ahead and start with onboarding time, right? With the onboarding to Azure Arc, what's really critical is limiting the role and lifetime if you're using a service principal identity and using that connected machine onboarding role. So we have that specific connected machine onboarding role that restricts your RBAC capability to just onboarding that Arc server. And it's really important that if you're using a service principal, you're not giving it a contributor access, for example, or even if it's through RBAC where you're giving a specific individual access for Arc server, it's that onboarding role only. What's also important is when you're using service principals for onboarding to restrict the lifetime of that SPN, right? Our default is, I believe, 30 days or less. So you really want to restrict that lifetime where possible as well to mitigate any risk. The next piece we want to highlight here is protecting secrets in onboarding script with encryption. So for example, with our group policy, we actually have a default script that includes encryption of the service principal secret. So we highly recommend that when you're using your SPN secret and not having that in plain text for its scale deployments, for example, using System Center Configuration Manager or Ansible as well. The third and fourth points are also critical. It's really important that you stay up to date in terms of your connected machine agent. We have a lot of security fixes and a lot of quality fixes in addition to features that get launched, obviously, with the connected machine agent. So it's really critical you have a process there to stay with the latest for our agent in terms of update process. I also did want to share we have a preview for our auto agent upgrade, which will hopefully help with that as well, available, and we've shared that with our newsletter. And the final piece is making sure we're really deliberate about deploying to the appropriate subscription, resource group, and region, because a lot of the times there's inheritance of policy, but also inheritance of RBAC, depending on where you're landing that Arc-enabled server. And while you can move it, it's critical that oftentimes you land it right on the first go in terms of your organization's sort of regulatory requirements. So those are some of the critical pieces from an onboarding piece. Next, I'm going to dive into the extension manager, right? This is where a lot of the magic happens in terms of all of the neat capabilities, but this is also where there's a lot of potential risk in terms of all of the different extensions that might be enabled. So a few things to note here. One is you can actually disable the extension manager. So if you don't want any extensions enabled for Azure Arc, just the inventory capabilities or just the licensing capabilities, you can disable extension manager totally. Next, you actually have local agent security controls. So you can specify extension allow lists and block lists. So what we often have as customers only allow a specific subset of extensions that are organizationally approved. For example, just MDE, just AMA, for example, or just some of the patch update periodic assessment, for example. So you can specify allow lists and block lists on a per server basis. And this is a really powerful control. Another piece is we actually have agent modes. So in addition to our full mode, we actually have what's called a monitor mode. And with our monitor mode, we disable a lot of kind of custom script extension like capabilities. So with monitor mode, you only have AMA and AMA-based extension capabilities. So it's only read-only capabilities that you effectively have. So that's a powerful local control you can also use in order to restrict extension risk. And the final piece we wanted to highlight is it's critical you make sure your extensions are also getting upgrades, because there are extension CVEs and remediation. So keeping your extensions up to date is also important. There is auto extension upgrade capabilities that are available for a lot of extensions today as well. So that's part of our security best practices, is not just being selective and using these security controls to enable exactly which extensions you have organizationally approved, but also using auto extension upgrade and having processes in place to keep your VM extensions up to date. So that's a wrap on Extension Manager. Now we're going to be moving into the identity piece, right? So with HIMDS, with our authentication and authorization. So every single Arc-enabled server, it gets a system-managed Microsoft Entra ID, right? And that's what's used for authorization, right? Part of that is there is a certificate valid for 90 days and stored on local disk. It's really critical that that cert is protected. And the final piece we wanted to highlight is, again, you want to limit the RBAC rules for control and access for your Arc-enabled server, right? So you want to make sure that whoever has access to the Arc-enabled server, for example, use the connected machine administrator role, or you can even specify more granular Entra roles with subset of Azure services that administrator will get access to. So that's the best practice here. So again, we have system managed identity for every single Arc-enabled server for authorization. We have a local cert that should be protected, valid for 90 days. And again, if you're disconnected for over 45 days, you know how the Arc server expires? That's what's happening. It's that cert that effectively expires that you can no longer authorize against. And so that's why you have to re-onboard your Arc-enabled server. So it's also important to keep connectivity for at least every 30 days. Otherwise, you do run that risk of not being able to run the reconnect, of having an expired Arc server. We have to redeploy agent and reconnect. So that's a wrap in terms of the HIMDS, the authorization piece. Next, I want to talk a bit about the machine configuration piece and the connectivity platform as well. And so with the connectivity platform with SSH Arc, Windows Admin Center, Run Command, there's a lot of robust server management capabilities that you get. But at the same time, sometimes these don't meet the organization's regulatory requirements, and you don't want to have these remote access capabilities enabled. So you can actually disable these. Just like with our extension allow list block list, you can enable or disable the connectivity platform and all of these different management services that are included there if you don't want to have your admin have remote connectivity capabilities to your Arc-enabled server. Each of these capabilities are opt-in as well. So these aren't enabled by default, these are opt-in, but you can even disable that opt-in capability by turning off the connectivity platform as well. One final thing to note here, and one recommendation is we have a bunch of security baselines, auditing capabilities, and assignments that are available through machine configuration. And so it really is a best practice if you have the guest config capability to at least do some of the security auditing, security baselines that we have by default for Azure and use that to get security compliance recommendations and visibility for your Arc connected service as well. And that's sort of a wrap in terms of the guest connectivity piece and machine configuration. All right. So final thing I wanted to touch on is networking. And networking could probably take up an entire session on its own. But just so everyone's aware, connections are TCP over port 443. Our HTTP connections use HTTPS SSL TLS with officially signed and verified certifications. And moreover, all connections are outbound unless they're explicitly specified. Like you're already aware, we do have support for private link, for private endpoint, site-to-site VPN, or ExpressRoute for customers that want to keep all of their traffic in the Azure backbone. Additionally, we have the Azure Arc Gateway, where we're reducing a lot of the networking endpoints, like you learned about from Jalen in an earlier community call, and that's currently under gated public preview. So that's a highly recommended as well in terms of limiting the number of networking endpoints that you're having to open up. So that's a wrap in terms of our networking connectivity piece, but a high recommendation is using Gateway, and if your organization requires, using private link as well. But even beyond private link, there are some security by default in terms of the connectivity practices we use with the connected machine agent with Azure Arc. With that, that's a summary of some of the core security best practices. So you saw across machine configuration, the networking piece, across our hybrid instance metadata service and authorization capabilities, across extension manager, and all the way back to onboarding. There's a lot of security both by default and by control that you can take advantage of. Now, the final piece that I want to highlight is really leveraging Defender for servers. We have a lot of our customers with Azure Arc, obviously using Arc for deploying their Defender for server capabilities. The This is critical in terms of getting more granular vulnerability assessment, but a lot of hardening recommendations, adaptive application control, guardrail capabilities as well. So we really highly recommend customers using the Defender for Server capabilities that you can enroll at a subscription-wide level for your Azure Arc connected machines as well. With that, that's a wrap in terms of what I had to plan to share in terms of our security best practices and security both by control and design for the Azure Arc agent. And again, I want to emphasize that we do have more robust security guidance today that we've delivered with our documentation. And so if you go to our docs today, you'll be able to see our entire section focused on just security with each of these kind of broken out and explained even further, more details in terms of tier 0 assets like domain controllers, security best practices there as well. And again, we want to emphasize our integration with Defender for Servers, with Defender for Cloud, and how all of your Arc-enabled servers that appear there really benefit from the same sort of security capabilities and hardening that any Azure VM would also benefit from as well. So here in our security inventory view, you can see not just Azure VMs, but also Arc-enabled servers all appear in a unified view from a security hardening perspective. That is if that loads. All right. Perfect. So yeah, here you can see a bunch of different Azure VMs, but you'll also be able to granularly see some Azure Arc-enabled servers. So in that view as well. So we can go ahead for resource type. And I believe we can filter in for just our Azure Arc servers. And we're going to be able to see sort of the security best practices there being applied as well, any threats that are being detected, and we can double click. So for example, I'll just open this one up, and I believe this is an AWS machine that we've connected through the multi-cloud connector, which is also in public preview. And you can see recommendations, alerting, installed apps, just like you would for an Azure native VM. And when it comes to some of these recommendations, again, you can literally point and click in order to remediate through our logic apps for your Arc server, just like you would for your Azure native VMs as well. So with that, that's a wrap for what we had planned for the Azure Arc community call. I'm not sure if there's any further questions. Yes, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hey, great presentation. Thanks for going through all that really powerful and interesting stuff. I just wanted to kind of touch on what you were talking about there right at the end. So when we onboard a machine, right, with the when we onboard a machine to Arc, it installs the AMA agent, right, going forward. So my question is, with that being installed, do we then have to, maybe I missed it and you said this, do we then have to take additional steps to see those recommendations within Defender, or do we get that kind of that foundational CSPM protection for Defenders for servers by default? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to Defender, you actually want to have to configure that. So
Okay.
go ahead. I believe it's in getting started. Let me open up the right one because I think it's your environment settings. There we go. So we're able to configure with our environment settings at a subscription level, whether or not you want to enable or basically disable some of these capabilities. So for example, we could go here for one of these, and I believe you specify the Defender plans that you're enabling. So you have foundational CSPM, but you also have servers, and you're able to select the tiers, and you're able to specify that at a subscription or connector level. And that's what's going to specify if you're getting onboarded to Defender or not for those resources detected in that subscription or through that connector.
Gotcha. Okay. So even though the AMA agent is installed, we still have to configure Defender for servers to be able to get the security recommendations.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, if there are no further questions, we'll call it a day for today's session. Thank you so much for everyone for attending, and looking forward to seeing everyone back next month. We're going to continue to keep really jam-packed agendas going forward. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye.